This is the Casey Lewis Show with me, your host, Casey Lewis. And with this first episode, we need to talk about what this show is going to be about. And to answer that, we're going to talk about primarily Royals baseball. And you go to the other side of the Truman Sports Complex, you see nothing but success, right? Won three of the last five Super Bowls. And Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce and Andy Reid have almost solidified themselves to be one of the greatest trios of players and coaches in NFL history. And then you go back to over to Kauffman Stadium, and it's been 9 years since the World Series has been won in 2015. We're now in 2024, and the future is only starting to look bright. In the 9 years since the Royals have won the 2015 World Series, they have gone 499 wins to 695 losses for a 41.9% win percentage in those 9 years. And last year, coming off of a franchise tying record, and not in a good way, tying the 2005 Royals for 106 losses. So, to say that the future is bright is really hard to say for the other side of the Truman Sports Complex while the Chiefs are dominating and looking to almost do something impossible and repeat the Super Bowl. It's been a long 9 years for Royals baseball, and as someone who's been watching the Royals for a very long time, for most of my life, it is hard to watch the team sometimes, and 106 losses is frustrating. It's to put it lightly, it was a very frustrating year to watch. But I liked some things about it that weren't bad, and it showed it showed some growth and a prospect of something better to come in the future years to maybe get another shot at what the Royals did in 2014 and 2015 and make the playoffs and have some kind of success. And we've seen that with Bobby Witt Jr. Rise to stardom in that last year in the 2023 season. But if you think that Bobby Witt's going to be able to get the rest of that roster over the hump, I hate to tell you it, but that's not going to be the case. Bobby Witt can only do so much. Just ask and look at what Mike Trout's doing with the Los Angeles Angels. He is no doubt a Hall of Famer, and with hopefully some better health in his 30s, go on to become one of the greatest, not just have a great peak career in those ages where Jaws, a stat that is used to evaluate the peak seasons of Hall of Famers. So, and that's another thing. This show is going to be a lot of numbers, just because that's what I like. I am a big baseball numbers guy. The reason why I like baseball as much as I do is not because I'm a former player or have some kind of connection to the sport. I just started going to the games as an adolescent and being infatuated with all the numbers that are in baseball. And StatCast era of baseball has only made that even better for numbers. And it shows so much more about the game than just your standard slash line of average, on base, and slugging. Those show some and basic understanding of players, and StatCast has given us so much analytic data that shows so much more in what the numbers can tell about a player and how they actually stand up against the rest of the league. So that's an introduction to this show. What it is going to be about is going to be heavy with numbers, and those that are just listening to the audio podcast version of it, I'm going to apologize because there are going to be some numbers that may not make sense just audio, just hearing it through audio, and that is something that this will also be uploaded to YouTube, and the YouTube will have some better visuals to explain what all is going on with these numbers, but I will try my best to explain them as much as I can. Now, on to the first episode. Spring training starts next week. Alright, this is being recorded technically on the 20th, so in reality it starts in a few days, where the team starts to play actual games. They're no longer just practicing with themselves, and with that, there's a lot to go, a lot of ground to cover. In the spring training, there's the 40-man and then the non-roster invites that are all fighting to get on the 26-man roster. And there's a lot of ways to go about what to look for and who to watch and everything that you could imagine. A lot of MLB writers have pointed out there are some they have their player that they want to watch on the Royals during the spring training, and I'm not going to follow their lead on that. Their points are a lot of just the questions of pitching that were last year. Almost every article I saw highlighted they need to see more of Cole Reagans, who, if played the entire year and looked the way that he did with the Royals, he could have probably made a bid for a Cy Young contention season. And that would have been the first since Zach Greinke in 2009. And the team in that situation would have been another bad team. Not as bad. In the 2009 year, Zach Greinke had a little bit more support than Cole Reagans would have in terms of a win-loss record. So a lot of Cole Reagans talk, a lot of Nick Lofton talk about who to watch offensively. They want to see more Nick Lofton. They want to see him make a bid for the roster. And I do have two players that I did. So we're going to cover 4 players today's episode. These are the people that I want to watch in spring training, and the first 2 are going to be players that need to essentially prove it. This is a prove it spring training for them. Because otherwise, it's not going to be good for them. They were on the team last year, and if the winning motto is going to take over, and it showed, like John Sherman, the chairman of the Royals, showed that he is interested in trying to win more baseball games. And with that, with what he did in the offseason, spending $100 million, getting Lugo, Michael Wacha, Garrett Hampton, or like some of the big 3 that of the free agent moves ever done. and Seth Lugo being the biggest, showed a willingness to attempt to be better. Because homegrown talent has been very slow in the minor league progression, but then also reflecting in the major league progression. And Bobby Witt is about the only one that has shown any real prospect outside of the Royals, bad rosters, being a caliber player that could succeed on a different roster if that was the situation. I like what I've seen from Vinny Pasquantino. He's shown a great contact potential with occasional power and plays an all right glove over at first base, but he can't stay healthy. It's cool to hit and do all this and look good for 50 games. Problem is, baseball is 162 games, and playing 50 games every year and looking good while doing it, yeah, it's cool. It shows that can be a future platoon guy if health really can't be something that you can continue to show. So, but I think Vinny Pasquantino has shown, when healthy, that he is a good option at first base. So that puts a problem for someone like Nick Lofton, who primarily did play first base, played second base. The Matt Quintrero has come out and said a lot in the offseason while signing Adam Frazier, signing Garrett Hampton, to say that Michael Massey is their guy for second base. I'm not opposed to it. I think he played a lot of good defense and maybe takes a couple steps in the right direction for the bat. That would be ideally what would solidify that bit of confidence over at second base. Because you have Bobby Witt playing shortstop. You moved Maikel Garcia over to third base. You picked it up well. Garcia looked great. At times, showed a really good leadoff potential. Looked good. And was able to hit and get on base well. But there's also inconsistencies in that. So, with Nick Lofton, we'll get more into the numbers on him towards the end. It's just what it's going to be. Another comment on the what to expect for this. This is going to be a weekly thing at most. I intend to do like a weekly recap of each game. Probably going to be a Tuesday upload. So from Tuesday to Tuesday, we're going to see what the Royals did that week, what was good, what was bad. Hopefully a lot more positives than negatives, because it was hard to watch the Royals last year struggle to win a series. It was almost April, from about May to the end of the year. I don't think they won a single series, or if they did, it was very far and few between. No sweeps for sure, I remember that much. And that kind of comes down to what John Sherman was wanting to. John Sherman and J.J. Piccolo, the general manager, wanted to focus on in the offseason, and that was getting pitching help, as that is something that struggles with it. Another players at MLB writers I've seen through the MLB Network app, through the Score, have shown that Daniel Lynch is another player that they're watching. They want to see a lot of in spring training. Alright, I can see it. Dude, he's been plagued with a lot of injuries in his time on the big league roster, shoulder issues, I think finger blisters at some point as well. So there's just a lot going on with Daniel Lynch. It's looked promising at times, but has also struggled a lot in those big league experiences. The same can be said for like Chris Bubich, who looked great last year, but was shut down due early in the year due to Tommy John surgery, and that was rather unfortunate because he was definitely looking to take a step in the right direction. I want to see what he does in spring training if he plays. The Royals took him off the 60-day DL in December, so maybe we see some Bubic in spring training, if not a couple months in, as he finishes up rehab in the minor leagues once the season officially starts in March, in the end of March. But enough about what other people and writers are talking about. It's time to talk about who I want to talk about, right? This is my show. We're going to talk about players that I want to watch in spring training, the prove it players, the players that I think really got to prove it. I have two of them for you this week as an introduction of who I want to see, and we'll get to see a couple of games in next week for the first recap episode. Essentially, this is just an introduction. No games have been played. Can't report on what I'm seeing in the games because there's no games being played yet. So let's start with an offensive player that I want to see a really good spring and some kind of pressure for him on the fight for the roster spot. I really am not too impressed to say that he's going to just easily get the starting spot. I think realistically there needs to be some kind of pressure for this player to really try to not get an easy path on being a starter for the Royals, and that is MJ Melendez. I know a lot of people like MJ Melendez. He's a good guy. From what all I hear, it's from social media videos that the Royals do. He's always involved. So he's essentially one of the faces of the franchise. But looks and PR aren't everything. Like, we need performance too. And, the same thing with Vinny Pasquantino. Being the pass squatch, that's fun. But if you're only playing 60 games out of 162, what's the point of being a face of the franchise? We know Bobby Witt Jr. is officially, the face of Royals baseball right now. And we'll see if Cole Reagans takes that step and continues to show himself as one of the faces of the franchise. But MJ Melendez, as being a face of the franchise, let's look at the numbers. And here we go. So he hit .235, 16 homers, and essentially, and you look at the terms of WAR, which is wins above average, which compares the MLB collective average for that year in stats, in every offensive stat, and compiles it into a nice number called WAR, wins above average. And the more positive that number is, the more you are above average as that in your position across the major leagues. MJ Melendez, 0. He was average. He had 0 WAR. So, MLB average. Cool. That's fun and all. But when you're 56 and 106, I don't know if average is going to be good enough. So, let's take a look into these numbers. Let's go deeper. Let's look at some of these StatCast numbers. He had a hard hit percentage of 42%, compared to the MLB average of 2023. MLB average was 33. So MJ Melendez hitting the ball harder than the average bear. Fly ball percentage, 43.6. So right there with that average, we see that he is consistently hitting the ball hard, and hard hit percentage being shown with a higher exit velocity. Barrel percentage shows good hits, essentially. What's being good. Uh, Kind of like hitting the sweet spot of the bat with launch angle, exit velocity. 11.4. So 11.5%, MJ Melendez is getting a good hit. So let's go to kind of what he was known for in the minor leagues, being kind of a power threat. Where does he stack up there? The 398 slugging. Ideally, you would like to see that number above 400 to really be considered a power hitting threat. So, right around there. Again, 16 homers, not hitting the ball hard a lot. Kauffman Stadium is big, but when you're 50% and higher of pull hitting down the lines in Kauffman, it's not as hard to hit home runs, especially the left-handed bat. His expected slugging was 428, so there's a 30-point difference in where he did hit for extra bases versus where he should have. And that kind of comes down to 29 or 28.2% strikeout. He's striking out 28.2%. It's not the worst for the Royals. Nick Prado wins that battle pretty handedly with a 40% strikeout percentage and not even being a full starter. But a regular starter after Vinny had to miss a majority of the season with shoulder injury. Kind of Nick Prado took over. Good defense. That was essentially what Nick Prado provided. Offensively, there's a reason why he hit the bottom third of the lineup routinely. Let's go to ISO, which shows just how hitting worked as what was a true power number. So we looked at slugging. That is essentially the percentage of how many times a base hit is going to be an extra base hit. So 40% of the time being an extra base hit, that number gets fluctuated based off of consistently hitting doubles. You hit more triples and homers, and it's essentially just a number for how many bases you're going to get per extra base hit. You can look at a batting average in a sense. So 235 is his actual batting average. We'll talk about another thing about that batting average fluctuating in a sense, but we can look at what's called ISO. It's isolated power. It's taking that slugging number and minusing average, and you get a 163. So it was 163. He was a 163 power hitter, and a 235 overall average is essentially what ISO shows is your batting average for power. And then there are some other numbers that show how much offensive production can really show, how well that is. And that being weighted runs created, or WRC. So WRC for MJ Melendez, 69. As funny as that number is, not that good in this context. WRC league average, 100. And you can then take that a step further and be like, I hear you say, oh, but Kauffman Stadium, it's a big outfield. It shows it's hard hard for players to create runs. True. So, Kauffman Stadium does play a role into it. It's kind of like the Coors effect. Not as bad. Coors effect, WRC, pretty high. And that's why WRC Plus, when created, Plus takes into consideration all the stadiums and the impact that the stadiums have. WRC Plus does look a little bit more positive. It shows that WRC Plus at a 92, still below league average, but it's a little bit closer. So essentially, from your kind of standard offensive stats, MJ Melendez, 0 WAR, average player. Hits the ball hard most of the time. Not a majority of the time, at 42%, but shows some promise. And there was something about MJ Melendez last year. There's a lot of things that were going on for MJ Melendez, and which kind of showed that there were some struggling numbers in there. And he played a battle of two halves. And a battle of two halves. And essentially, if you're not a Mizzou basketball fan, you may not remember Conzo Martin played two halves of basketball, and he was a good half. He would give you a good half of basketball as a coach. One half looked really good, the other half looked bad. It fluctuated on what half looked good. Mizzou basketball in a very interesting predicament of yet to win a conference game as of this recording, and tonight they are going against Tennessee, so I see 13 games in a row lost. But we're going to get back to the Royals. I'm Mizzou fan, enjoyed Mizzou football this year. Hoped for Mizzou basketball to kind of continue. Hasn't gone well. And we'll see where that goes. But back to the idea of halves. MJ Melendez played half. He struggled really badly. Most of the first half, he hit below 100 or below 200, and honestly, 150 was what felt like his batting average most of that first half. It did pick up eventually, and finished the first half in those 84 games with a 206. With a 206 average. He had 6 home runs, struck out 103 times. WRC plus 68. So, again, from a production standpoint, really below average. But he had 35 walks. That's always positive. Team doesn't do a whole lot of walks. His 10.3% walk rate on the entire year was third overall on the team, the best in 70 plus games. And we're going to go to a different stat here. So with a 206 average, which is fine, not really, that's really bad, it's concerning, but for where the Royals were at the time, it was pretty standard. Number 127 ISO, 29.8%, and a strikeout percentage. So, striking out almost 30% of the time in the first half, 6 home runs, 35 walks, 103 strikeouts, 68 weighted runs created, plus there are some other numbers that we can use to compare how well a player is doing, and we can look at, when we talk about players that are doing just hitting the ball well. Just hitting the ball well. 30% of the time you're striking out, but that means that other 70% you're putting the ball in play. So, what was MJ Melendez's batting average on balls in play? Well, I hear you ask, what kind of number would that exist? Well, there is a number that exists for it. It's called BABIP. Fun fact. And that is batting average on balls in play. MJ Melendez hit 285 when the ball was in play. And had a 276 weighted on base average. And that takes in consideration all offensive categories for on base percentage and averages, and hit 276 with a WOBA, which is just on base percentage with some extra numbers tied into it. And that was the first half. Not great. Pretty lackluster, matched how the Royals played. Most of the first half, it was not too great. But so 127 ISO, not hitting a whole lot for power either. So what was going on? 84 games. In those 84 games, MJ Melendez bouncing around, not quite sure where his spot in the offense in the field of play is going to be. You know, Salvador Perez, catcher, MJ Melendez brought up as the backup catcher, maybe to eventually take over for Salvi. Salvi moved over to DH. Didn't quite happen that way. Freddie Fermin came into the picture and took over those those catching duties for most of the season, and Salvi kind of got to play DH, take a rest on his body. Getting up there in age, it's hard to play catcher into your mid-30s. But so MJ Melendez losing the starting catching job to Salvador Perez, Freddie Fermin. So where's MJ Melendez to go? He's going to go to the outfield. Only problem, he was a catcher by trade. He was drafted as a catcher. He played the minor leagues as a catcher. So he had to pivot to playing left and right field. And it's a hard thing to do. And especially big shoes to fill defensively in left field because, well, for so long, Alex Gordon made it look easy. And we're a couple of years away from Alex Gordon out in left field. So the expectation that the next left fielder that plays every day is going to be Alex Gordon again was Gold Glove defense immediately. It's a hard burden for someone to carry, and that kind of showed for MJ Melendez. He struggled to pick it up, and was just a lot of pressure to learn a new position, to keep fighting for that roster spot. Eventually kind of solidified, had some pretty good outfield assist at times, but showed, for the first year of playing left field, it's hard to make that transition from catcher to left field, and eventually did kind of stop bouncing around from playing catcher and right field, and kind of solidified as the left fielder. Fangraphs has him projected for 2024 to play 68% of the games in left field. So he's going to look good and maybe continue to grow as a left fielder. Not to have Gold Glove caliber defense, but to contribute WAR in an offensive and a defensive perspective as well, because WAR also takes into consideration your defensive contributions with errors and fielding percentage. WAR is a nice collective number that takes into every possible number that you can think of for baseball that's going to show the worth of a player. MJ Melendez finished the year with a 0 WAR. So, league average. Again, turned out average, but at 106 losses, I don't know if that's going to be too great to show. But why did I highlight him? Because he didn't hit 206 the entire year. Eventually, he gets the batting average up. We know he eventually gets to 235. But let's talk about the second half. How do we get from 206 to 235? And it's not hitting 206 consistently. That second half, he turned it up. He played a lot better. So in 64 games in that second half of baseball, MJ Melendez hit 10 home runs, had a 26.2 strikeout percentage. So strikeout percentage is down 3.6%. Home runs are up 4 in 20 less games. 67 strikeouts, so he's striking out less. He had a 273 average in the second half alone. So he looked like a completely different player. He had 27 walks in 20 less games. So first half, he had 35 walks total. And then second half, in 64 games, had 27 walks. Had a 211 ISO power. 124 weighted runs created plus. So he was a 344 BABIP and 356 WOBA. So in terms of what you wanted to see out of a player, he had a great second half. He played a lot better. And I don't know if it was just due to kind of solidifying that roster spot and you can kind of focus back on hitting and not fear of where you're going to play. If you're going to stay on the roster, you're going to go back down. The AAA Omaha. Like someone like Nate Eaton, who was up and down a lot last year and kind of never really found his spot, either non-roster invite, would be a fun player to watch in spring training and to see what all he's worked on. He played pretty well in his time in the minor leagues, but they just didn't have a spot for him. MJ Melendez kind of showed his capabilities in left field, and then Drew Waters and Kyle Isbell took over in center and right. And so there wasn't just a spot for Nate Eaton. Nelson Velasquez, kind of the second option for DH behind Salvi. So in terms of outfielders to watch in spring training, that's why I don't have an outfielder to watch for spring training, because there's just a log jam. There's too many hands in the cookie jar for the outfield to contend with, for everyone to consistently play. There's 3 spots, and maybe 3.5 if you want to say DH. But if Salvi's going to be DH, Fangraphs has Salvi playing a lot of catcher. That's obviously not kind of how that played out. Last year, Freddie Fermin played a lot of catcher. He eventually kind of stopped being like the number like rotation 4 and 5 guy to kind of being that everyday guy, because he had a good bat. He looked good when he hit and played pretty good defense. And it pains me to say that Salvador Perez just couldn't cut the mustard anymore. Fangraphs and StatCast defensive ratings have Salvi in the minus, and it pains to say because, he was once the sheriff. He won several gold gloves during those kind of good, those 2014, 2015, 2013, that early 2010 era of Royals baseball. Salvador Perez was a staple of defensive catchers, and Yadier Molina was over in the National League. Kansas City in the American League had Salvador Perez, and then Martin Maldonado as well, and Christian Vasquez. So there was a lot of good defensive catchers. Martin Maldonado did play for the Royals for a while. In those kind of right after those post World Series years that they were trying to just plug some holes and maybe make it. Didn't turn out that well. And after 2017, had 60 wins years in those last 2 years of Ned Yost, and then Matheny came in, and that kind of he had a 74 win year in 2019, and then that was it. It was just downhill from there. The, honestly, watching the 2022 Royals was more frustrating than the 2023 Royals. The 2022 Royals won more games, but they were just frustrating to watch. The offense was never there consistently. If you look up the top 10 longest shutout inning streaks, you're going to find the 2022 Royals on there two or three times in the top 10, and it'll be history. It was frustrating to watch the 2022 Royals. The 2023 Royals were frustrating in their own right because they had 106 losses, but the offense was more consistent under Matt Quintero than it ever was under Mike Matheny. Pitching wasn't there, and that's going to pivot to my next guy to watch for spring training. They really got to have some kind of positive thing, like a positive spring. I just find it hard to see him having a bigger role if it doesn't go well. And that is going to be, as Rex Hudler liked to call him, Big Nasty, a.k.a. Carlos Hernandez, a very short-lived closer for the Royals. After Aroldis Chapman was traded, they thought, let's give it to Carlos Hernandez. And at times he looked good. His stuff was electric. And he could handle those kind of situations. That was very short-lived. And we'll get into some of those numbers. And then MacArthur took over and became a little bit more of a staple of that closing job, and we'll see if Will Smith or MacArthur can kind of who's going to be the closer. I know there are a lot of reports that the Royals wanted to make a move for another relief pitcher, but spring training starts in 2 days. I don't know if there's any time to make another move for a closer and get him into what the Royals want out of him. But let's talk about Carlos Hernandez. Very interesting player to watch. Because again, he had his moments that looked great and looked good when he was coming into relief. So in 67 games, he pitched 70 innings. 4 of them were starts. He had 4 starts on the year, 70 innings, 5.27 ERA. Not too great, but a little bit closer to the league average stat. So the league average in 2023, MLB average for ERA was 4.33. So we're almost a whole point above that. But fielding independent pitching is a fun little stat. It's kind of like ISO for power hitters. We're gonna take away some aspects of it, but it's not quite ISO. It's a little bit different. Fielding independent pitching is a stat that is an ERA when it takes out the other team's defensive rating. So it is just an ERA based off the pitcher's merit. Carlos Hernandez had a 4.28 fielding independent pitching. MLB average for for fielding independent pitching, 4.33. So, in that sense, he was a little bit better than league average. And for wins above average, he had a .3. So, really slightly above average pitcher. .3 compared to 0. Not much of an improvement. So, let's look at some more numbers. He had a 25.7 strikeout percentage, 10.3 walk percentage, and then we take a step back to some more kind of standard pitching numbers. We have 9.9 K per 9, which is every 9 innings pitched. This is how many strikeouts Carlos Hernandez would get. 9.9 is how many per 9 innings. Is how many strikeouts Carlos Hernandez was getting. That's pretty good. That's really good. 8.7 was the 2023 average, so he was above average K per 9 strikeout. 3.99 walks per 9 innings. That's not too great, especially when you're coming out of the bullpen. You're pitching 1-2 innings at a time. Giving up 4 walks per 9 innings pitched is not too great. MLB average 3.3 walks per 9. So he's giving up a lot of walks for a relief pitcher that's coming out 1 or 2 innings at a time. But he's striking out a lot, which is cool. Goes nice with a 99.3 mile per hour fastball average. Throw the fastball hard, throw it 54% of the time. So his fastball was pretty good in terms of outs above average. A little bit above average on the fastball. He had a 1 win on the year, 10 losses, and 4 saves for Carlos Hernandez. Those 4 saves are kind of shocking at times because we'll get to a stat where being a relief pitcher, it doesn't look good for Carlos Hernandez. And is why he's on the list. So let's look at a number. 63.7% left on base. So 63.7% of the time he was leaving runners on base. As a relief pitcher, you want that number high. 63.7, not great. Compared to the MLB average, 72%. So below average, leaving runners on base. For a relief pitcher, especially a closer, not too great. He had a 287 BABIP, so that number goes both ways. It goes for hitters. It also goes for pitchers to show what's happening there. So when balls were in play, which were 20, correction. So he had a 25% strikeout percentage. So then the other 75% of the time, the ball is in play, hitting 287. We'll get to some more of those numbers to explain why that number is that high. So, Carlos Hernandez, 44.5% hard hit rate. Means that when 44% of the time batters are hitting, when they're making contact off his pitches, they're having a high exit velocity. Again, not what you want as a relief pitcher. Coming in for an inning or 2. I mean, realistically, that's a number that you don't want that high in general as a pitcher, but especially when you're coming out for 1 or 2 innings, or you're coming in a situation where there are runners on base and you got to stop it. 44% of the time, someone's hitting that ball 95 miles or higher, and granted, laws of physics implies that, well, the fastball's coming in at 99 miles an hour, you make decent contact with it, it's not going to lose a whole lot of exit velocity, but this is not a physics show. This is a baseball show where I'm going to talk about baseball numbers and to promote whatever narratives that I am going to show. And Carlos Hernandez needing a good spring training because his 2023 numbers not being good is that narrative. Speaking of exit velocity and hard hit percentage, he had an average of 90.2 exit velocity and 90.2 miles per hour, that is. And let's talk about those closing numbers, why he lost the job as quickly as he got it. So, Carlos Hernandez had 17 meltdown outings. 17 of them. That's not good. Obviously, a meltdown implies that he's blowing the lead, and it's not good. So, we have ISO for hitting, the show power isolated power, how well they're hitting, average for power. We do have a fun little number for pitchers that is based off a leverage context of what it's a rating of how an intensity rating of how much it is, what the leverage is when they come into a game, when they come out of the game, and when that number is differentiate when they come out of the game, and that number is lower, it helps, and it shows a nice little number called clutch. It's just a compile of those numbers of when they come into the game, what the leverage is versus the leverage of coming out of the game. So you want a higher positive clutch number. Let's take a look at what Carlos Hernandez showed, and it is a negative 2.05. So, assuming average is 0, and it is, he was 2 times worse than the average pitcher in clutch situations. That was our closer and leverage position player when there were intense moments in games and you needed a guy to come put the fire out, to use an old saying, use the fireman pitcher. Carlos Hernandez was that. He was a closer and just a relief pitcher in general. You want that number high. You know, Dan Quisenberry, great all-time Royals closer, was also a very good fireman. He was able to put fires out with a coach Haver in the 2015 World Series run, was able to come pitch an inning or two and keep it in game. And he keep the players in game. So we talked about he had a good fastball, like 99.3 average fastball velocity. Like, that is awesome. In theory, you think that would equate to success. But if you don't know where the fastball is going, the hard fastball isn't anything special anymore. Nolan Ryan was successful because he threw a lot harder than the average pitcher back in his day. Well, when every relief pitcher is throwing 95 plus consistently, you kind of lose your peak and advantage of it. So, let's talk about, we talked about the high batting average in play, 287. 300 plus is, a 300 average is, for an offensive hitter, that's great. You want to hit above 300, that shows you're above elite hitter. Not so much for Carlos Hernandez's case, 287. Leaking oil, pretty bad. But how did we get to that such high batting average in play? So, 81.8% of the time, the ball, any ball that he threw in the zone, 81.8% of the time, contact was made. Almost 82% of the time, a pitch within the strike zone by Carlos Hernandez, contact was made. On average, taking into the zone and out of the zone, 72.6%. He had a almost 73% contact percentage as a relief pitcher, coming in leveraged situations. Or the closer. 73% of the time, hitters were making contact off Carlos Hernandez. And you wonder why 286 batting average on balls in play. He had a 51.7% swing rate, swing percentage of 51.7% of the time. Pretty cool. Helps with a 26% strikeout rating. And then we take that in a step in, 43% on swings and misses in the strike zone. So, in general, a down year, and not a very good year. ERA, exit velocity, about the only thing that was that career high for Carlos Hernandez, besides ERA, a positive career high with his average velocity. His average fastball velocity was the highest it's been in his career since he's been in the big leagues. Other than that, everything in this 4 years in the big leagues, it hasn't been good. It was third or fourth ranked. Nothing positive. It was a down year for Carlos Hernandez, but he kept getting put into situations that led to 106 losses. Hate to say it. A .3 WAR, cool. 0.3 wins above replacement, but 17 meltdowns. You're going to come in and these leverage situations, and you're going to go out there and make the nickname Big Nasty into something not positive, because I'll tell you, I use Big Nasty in the context of not positive to describe Carlos Hernandez at times when he was the closer. It was almost, he came in to close, start rolling your eyes, pack it in, because this game isn't going to get shut down. It's just how it was. Well, a minus two clutch rating. Yeah. So, Carlos Hernandez, bullpen, long reliever, not in high context and leverage situations, is what I'm seeing. If he had a good spring training, I think, like we said with MJ Melendez, I'm not sure if he gets an easy pass for to be the everyday left fielder. I don't know if Carlos Hernandez gets an easy pass for leverage situations. I think he's going to have to work on it a lot in spring training. He's going to have a pretty good spring training. I think he makes the roster no matter what. I don't see a situation where they don't have him as on the opening day roster unless they get real strict through spring training. But they need bullpen help and an established big league pitcher at this point, which is Carlos Hernandez. He's going to get you the average or slightly below average is probably about as best as it's going to get. So I don't see a world where MJ Melendez or Carlos Hernandez aren't on the roster to start opening day. But I question their abilities to consistently be in those positions that they were in last year. So, with that being said, those are the two big pitcher and hitter that I want to see have a really good spring training to kind of fight for their job in starting. Or in Carlos Hernandez's case, clothing or uh, leveraged spots. But there are two players that I'm going to highlight, and we're going to wrap up with these two players that I think are just going to be fun to watch to see how they do in spring training. I think they have a really good chance to fight for the roster for a roster spot. They were called up in parts of 2023 and did pretty all right. In the pitcher that we're gonna highlight, he did pretty decent at times. The hitter, these numbers are gonna be kind of glorified due to small capacity, but let's start with the big. Not, not, not so much big. He is 6'4", and a lefty, so he's often going to be called the big lefty. We're going to talk about the non-roster invite, Austin Cox. Austin Cox did come in at times for the Royals until he had a ACL's tear and missed the majority of the second half in the small window that he was called up. He did well at times, but then also went down with injury, so we don't know to the extent of what he did. With that being said, was removed from the 40-man roster to make room for Kyle Wright, Seth Lugo, a new pitcher. So he's a non-roster invite, but I think could have a good spring and get back on the opening day roster. Because who doesn't like a good lefty pitcher? We have Cole Reagans. Maybe Austin Cox can come out of the bullpen and help us more than just left-handed appearances. So, in his appearances for the 2023 Royals, Austin Cox started 3 games. I remember his starts for the most part. They were hit or miss. Like, in those 3 starts, like, most of the time it didn't go well, or they would keep him in the game longer than needed. And they had kind of the same situation with Alec Marsh, kind of getting put out there a little too long, and it kind of not going well. In 3 games, he started 24 games in general, 35 and 2/3 innings total. He had a 4.54 ERA, a little bit above the MLB average. Fielding independent pitching, 3.73. So almost a whole point different based off of his actual earned run average or versus what he did as a pitcher without fielders included. So was just his pitching merit alone, 3.73 ERA. That's pretty good. Just 50 points below the league average. 0.5 WAR, so half a win above MLB average. 8.33 K per 9, 4.29 walk per 9, 0.5 home run per 9 as a reliever. That's a good number. So that's a lot better than the 1.29 home runs per 9 that Carlos Hernandez was allowing. But with that being said, he did have a lower left on base percentage than Carlos Hernandez. He did have a 61.1% left on base percentage, so he's given up more bases than Carlos Hernandez. He did have a .01 clutch, so almost a clutch. Almost average clutch pitcher, but slight .01. So essentially average reliever in leverage situations. Only 3 meltdowns. 75.9% contact rating, not too great. That jumps up to 85.2 in the zone. Uh, 59.3% of the time, contact was being made outside of the zone. That's that's unfortunate, but it shows like even hitting the edges is not too great at times. So Austin Cox looked promising at times for the Royals last year in 2023. I look forward to seeing what he does in the spring, here in spring training, and maybe making a spot back onto the roster or at some point getting called back up. So, who's this offensive hitter that I was mentioning earlier, where the numbers a bit glorified, but they're looking pretty good in the limited time that he had in the big league roster. Of course, talking about the Royals' number one prospect in 2023, no longer the case. But I'm talking about Nick Lofton. Played first and second base. That's kind of the concern that I have with Nick Lofton is where does he go? Where does he play? He's not going to be the starter in first base or second base where he played last year in the September call-ups because Matt Quintero has made it very clear that he thinks Michael Massey is going to be the starter at second base. So where does Nick Lofton go? Because he's not going to go and take Vinny Pasquantino's spot. Vinny Pasquantino has first base essentially solidified as a starter. Matt Q has got Michael Massey at second base. So concerned there. Can have a good spring and come off the bench. I don't know if I agree with that too much. I think he deserves the right to be an everyday starter if he continues what he has done. Again, we're going to get into those numbers in a moment, but they are limited, but they looked really good. So, in 19 games and 68 plate appearances, Nick Lofton hit .323, slugged .435, and had an on-base percentage of .318. So 31.8% of the time, he was on base. That's pretty cool for a .4 WAR. And it's already rivaling some of the players that we talked about and productivity. 118 weighted runs created plus, 348 WOBA for weighted on base average, and walked 5.9% of the time. Pretty decent walk percentage. MJ Melendez had a 10.3. It was the third best and was the best for essentially a starter. So walk percentage not too high. The Royals, as they have deviated very far from the World Series team under Ned Yost, that took walks a little bit more, but also were trying to get on base in any way that they could. We are 9 years away from those days of the World Series team and where that was successful with a good bullpen. Royals do not have a good bullpen anymore. 17.6 strikeout rate was up there for Fangraph ratings, but I didn't want to say, oh, it was a great number because it's only in 19 games. But 17.6 is tied with Bobby Witt, what Bobby Witt Jr. had for on the year for strikeout percentage at a 113 ISO. So slugging percentage 435 looks good. Not so much when you look at it just strictly through a power stance. One thing I do find interesting in what he did in that high on base percentage was he scored runs. He had 2 stolen bases in 19 games, which was the bigger bases. Hopefully we get to see more stolen bases. I'm a good fan of stolen bases and hope to see it again be more of a relevant thing. Ronald Acuna, his 40-70 year is a good showing of it, and Bobby Witt almost having a 40-40 year himself. So Nick Lofton, 392 batting average in play, but he scored 10 runs and 10 RBIs in those 19 games. So that's pretty cool. Had a 7.8% barrel percentage, and then 35.3% hard hit percentage, and then a 10.8 average launch angle, a little bit below where you want to be as a hitter, but it's in that range. The 10 to 14 range, degree angle is where you want to be for successful outcomes the most in hitting. It's called very much part of the calculation of like barrel percentage and sweet spot hitting, which Fangraph didn't keep track of as well of the stat. And I'm gonna make reference to a lot of Fangraph numbers. I like Fangraphs. It gives me a lot of in-depth analysis where I can pull a lot of these numbers. Baseball Reference does a good job of collecting numbers as well, but Fangraphs is able to show me the StatCast numbers, and so I used a lot of StatCast for these numbers. I'm not sponsored yet. Maybe someday will be a Fangraph sponsorship, but not now. The first episode. But Nick Lofton looked good when he did play. Hopefully he can continue that in spring training and continue to impress and maybe work his way into being a starter somehow. I don't know how that would work. Michael Massey's defense is too good at second base. And the occasional moment of hitting, but primarily that defense at second base is going to be hard for Nick Lofton to overtake from an offensive production standpoint, as the Royals have historically liked their fielding. But Nicky Lopez, Whit Merrifield, kind of taking over Omar Infante. If you really want to, during those World Series runs, from those examples listed, second base, they've never really been concerned with the power production of a second baseman. They just want a decent glove, and that seems to be more or less where they want to go with it. But Nick Lofton could maybe potentially platoon, but it depends on what he does in spring training. I know I mentioned at the beginning here that Nick Lofton was a player that a lot of MLB.com writers had as their player to watch for the Royals, of what could Nick Lofton do during spring training. And, I said I wasn't going to follow their footpaths, and I'd try not to, because, well, you have access to the internet. You can read those articles by yourself. You don't need me to regurgitate them. I would hope that you would want a different opinion formed than what MLB.com had to say. So, and that's what I tried to do. But I did think that Nick Lofton was worth noting to see what he could do. But enough about what to watch for spring training, as the games are going to start in a couple days. And we'll just see what happens throughout the spring, and make sure to tune back in next week to the Casey Lewis show, where I'll recap those first couple games, and we'll see what the Royals look like in spring training. I know in the past, watching spring training games doesn't really equate to what the team does in production, because it always look good during spring training. Like last year, they looked good. The year before that, they had like one of the best records of the spring training games. and the Royals looked good in the spring. But then what have we done in the last 2 years? In those 2 years of good spring training, it hasn't shown well in regular season. So that's why I'm not taking a perspective of, oh, the team looks good. I need to see a couple of players look good. And that being MJ Melendez and Carlos Hernandez really needing to have a good spring to show what is going on. To be a big part of the 2024 roster. And that's in my opinion. I'm not an expert. I'm not some insider. I don't have connections to the Royals to promote this is what needs to happen. Obviously, Matt Quintrero and his coaching staff are looking at what they need to look at or what they want to look at for their to run the team. But from a fan perspective, these are the players I want to see. MJ Melendez have a good spring, and Carlos Hernandez have a good spring to kind of get back into a spot where they're showing something good. Because maybe Nelson Velasquez has a really good spring and takes over the starting job over in left field, or wins over right field, and then Drew Waters gets moved to left, and MJ Melendez takes a spot on the bench and become the platoon hitter because he had reverse splits against lefties, so he hit lefties well. But if that's the case, then that'd be an interesting outcome. I don't see that happening anytime soon, but with spring training, anything can really happen. I think outside of a couple of players, Bobby Witt Jr. and kind of about it, like solidified spots. Bobby Witt Jr., Michael Massey, and Giovanni Pasquantino have essentially been solidified. I'm very certain that Maikel Garcia is going to solidify third base. So your infield essentially is solidified. Freddie Fermin and Salvador Perez taking the catching duties. So then the outfield, logjam, a lot of players on the roster, a lot of outfielders getting invited, a lot of catchers being invited too. Carter Jensen, Logan Porter for maybe catcher 3 on the roster. We'll see what happens there. Logan Porter did all right in his time in the big leagues, but again with Nick Lofton, very limited in what he was able to do. So, but enough rambling. It's time to end. This has been episode 1 of the Casey Lewis Show.